Hello. This is the second in a series of videos on Martin Luther King's principles of nonviolence. And what I'd like to do here is talk about Dr. King's second principle. And we run into some pretty poetic language in talking about the idea behind the second principle. In Dr. King's own words, he says, I'm just paraphrasing slightly, nonviolence does not seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. And I and other nonviolence educators, as well as the King Center in Atlanta, we like the phrase "turn enemies into friends" as a way of capturing the idea of principle 2. The challenge of this principle for people seems to be our habitual way of treating our enemies and people that we don't like, or people that we think are less than ourselves. And with enemies or people that we think are so unlike us that we just, don't have a very high regard for them. First of all, we tend to avoid them. And because we avoid them, we don't really gather any information about who they are and what they're like. But the absence of that information doesn't stop us from developing stereotypes and strange ideas about them. And we are very prone to stereotyping our enemies, even though we really don't know anything about them. In the nonviolence world, we try to reverse those tendencies. And we recognize that we're not going to get anywhere with our enemies if we constantly avoid them. But we should find a way to interact in a way that might do some good. And often, that's possible very often, because our enemies are people too. They're actually very much like us. But in our thinking about them, we tend to emphasize the differences rather than the commonalities. Interestingly, Abraham Lincoln said something one time that's very similar to Dr. King's principle 2. He posed the question, am I not destroying my enemies when I make friends of them? And he was famously willing to hold his enemies pretty close to him. He formed his cabinet as a team of rivals. There's a book of that title about this and other things regarding Lincoln and his administration. But he brought into his cabinet his political enemies. And he surrounded himself with people that he knew would provide contrary opinions on many issues. He was killed, of course, just after the Civil War ended. But it's fascinating to speculate what he might have done if he had lived longer after the Civil War, because he did believe in holding the South responsible, but he wanted to keep those states in the Union, and he planned to be working with them. And he really didn't get to follow through on that intention. In psychology, there are many topics that relate to Dr. King's principle 2. We have lots of studies in social psychology of in-groups and out-groups, cliques of students in schools, for example, or in workplaces. we have many studies of short-term versus long-term goal setting. And very often with our enemies, we seem to be preoccupied with our short-term relationship with them, and in either keeping them at arm's length and continuing to avoid them, or hurting them in some way because we dislike them so much. And I think a few moments reflection will convince us that if we take a longer term view, we've got to realize that we're probably going to be living in the same world with those enemies for a long time. And perhaps our long-term relationship is something that we should put some thought into. If we look at actual history, enemies have not remained enemies for long periods of time. We used to be enemies with Japan and with Germany in World War II, and now we are trading partners, and we're seen as, relatively wealthy countries who have a lot of interests in common. Enemies don't stay enemies for long. That's the lesson of history. So why don't we plan for working with those enemies of the moment as if they will be allies in the future? And I think that changes our attitude toward those people. And psychology also informs us that we have the ability to be empathetic, to try to put ourselves in the shoes of other people. It takes an effort. Sometimes it takes a little training and a little skill to become better at it. But we have the ability to try to see things from another perspective and to exercise conciliation, to exercise interactions with other people, even if they are enemies or adversaries, in such a way that we don't burn our bridges and we keep options open for the future. One of my good friends, Rich Tarlian, who's a former police officer from Rhode Island, had a very thoughtful approach to community policing. And he used to be very aware that the kids he was dealing with on the street who were acting up and giving him a hard time today, they might be kids that he needed to have on his side next week. They might be important sources of information about things that had gone on in the neighborhood, people who had been hurt, or people who needed help. And so he practiced a method of community policing where he was always checking his own emotions to make sure that as a police officer, he was not getting out of control because these kids were so obnoxious and unlikable. And he developed the habit of asking himself the question, does this situation need another jerk? And his answer was, well, no situation benefits from having another jerk, so I'm not going to be that jerk. It's a good question to ask if we want to maintain behavior toward other people who are unlikable, that will preserve the possibility of working with them, with being friends with them, or at least being allies on particular issues with them in the future. There's a reflection of Principle 2 that I'd like to describe just to end this up, and it comes from the Nashville sit-in movement, which I often use as a source of examples because of my friendship with Bernard Lafayette, who was one of the student leaders. But after the students had won, and the city of Nashville had begun to desegregate its stores and restaurants in the downtown part of the city. It turned out that the merchants, the owners of the stores, who had been the students' enemies, the students had been sitting in their establishments and interfering with their normal course of business. Those merchants, after desegregation came to Nashville, admitted that they had really wanted it to happen for many years, because they knew that if the stores desegregated, they would have more customers. And in fact, Nashville went through a boom following desegregation. And economic prosperity often follows the victory of a campaign for civil rights. That's happened in the United States. It's happened in South Africa and many other countries, where greater acceptance between groups of people who had been opposed to each other leads to more economic activity, because there's more interaction going on between people. Okay, if you found this interesting, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. That helps everything along. And I will be back soon with a little discussion of Principle 3. So long for now.